the illusion of happiness. Schopenhauer once said that human desire is like a pendulum, swinging endlessly between pain and boredom. Think about it when we want something, whether it's a new job, a relationship, or the latest gadget. We're in pain. We feel incomplete, restless, and dissatisfied until we get it. But when we finally achieve that thing, how long does the satisfaction last? Days? Weeks? A few months if we're lucky. And then boredom sets in. We start looking for the next thing to chase. The cycle begins again. Why is this? Schopenhauer believed it's because happiness is not a state we can ever truly possess. It's a fleeting illusion, a mirage in the desert of life. When we reach out to grab it, it slips through our fingers. He argued that our very nature as human beings, our constant yearning, striving, and desiring makes sustained happiness impossible. And yet we keep chasing it, like a moth flying into a flame. Let's pause for a moment. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you felt truly, deeply happy? Not just content, but that euphoric, everything is perfect kind of happiness. And how long did it last before reality set back in? Was it minutes? Hours? Maybe a few days? Schopenhauer would say that this fleeting nature of happiness is proof that it's not real.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
It's a trick our minds play on us to keep us moving forward, to keep us striving, even though the end goal doesn't exist. He compared life to a treadmill. You can run as fast as you like, but you'll never actually get anywhere. The more you run, the more exhausted you become, but you can't stop because stopping feels like failure. Does that sound familiar? Maybe it's your career. Maybe it's your relationships. Maybe it's your social status. Whatever it is, the chase is endless, and the happiness you're seeking is always just out of reach. Here's where Schopenhauer gets really interesting. He believed that this constant striving is not just a personal problem, but a universal one. It's part of what he called the will to live. This is the blind, insatiable force that drives all of life, not just humans, but animals, plants, even the smallest microorganisms. The will to live is the reason we're constantly striving, constantly desiring, constantly chasing. It doesn't care about our happiness. Its only goal is to keep us alive and reproducing, no matter the cost. Think about that for a second. The very force that drives you to live is also the source of your suffering. It's the reason you can't be satisfied, no matter how much you achieve or acquire. It's the reason happiness is a trap, because as long as you're alive, the will to live will keep you chasing, and it will never let you rest. Practical life advice. Now, I know what you're thinking. If happiness is a trap, what's the point of living? That's a fair question, and Schopenhauer wrestled with it too. He wasn't saying we should give up on life or stop striving altogether. Instead, he believed that the key to a meaningful life is to change the way we think about happiness. First, we need to stop thinking of happiness as something we can achieve or possess. Instead, we should see it as a fleeting moment, a brief respite from the pain and boredom of life. And that's okay, because when we stop chasing happiness, we free ourselves from the trap. We stop running on the treadmill, and we start living in the present. Second, Schopenhauer believed that the best way to escape the trap of happiness is through what he called aesthetic contemplation. This means finding meaning and beauty in things that are outside of the will to live, things like art, music, nature, and philosophy. When we engage with these things, we step outside of ourselves, we stop striving, and we experience a kind of peace that's deeper than happiness. Here's a practical example. Think about the last time you listened to a piece of music that moved you to tears. In that moment, you weren't thinking about your desires or your goals. You weren't trapped in your own mind. You were completely present, completely absorbed in something greater than yourself. That's the kind of experience Schopenhauer believed could free us from the trap of happiness. But let's go even deeper. What if the very idea of happiness is flawed? What if the goal of life isn't to be happy, but to be free? Free from the endless cycle of pain and boredom. Free from the constant striving and desiring. Free from the trap. Let me ask you this: if happiness wasn't the goal of your life, what would you do differently? How would you live if you weren't chasing something that can never be caught? Why suffering is the fundamental truth of life. Schopenhauer's philosophy takes a sharp turn here, and it's not an easy pill to swallow. He believed that suffering is not just a part of life, it is life. To exist is to suffer. Let's think about this for a moment. From the moment we are born, we're thrust into a world where pain and struggle are inevitable. A newborn cries the second it enters the world. It doesn't smile or laugh at cries. Why? Because life, at its core, is a constant battle against discomfort, against the forces that threaten to extinguish us. Hunger, thirst, illness, aging, death, these are the universal conditions of existence. And yet we spend so much of our lives pretending that suffering is some kind of anomaly, something to be avoided or ignored. But what if suffering isn't a mistake? What if it's the very essence of life itself? Schopenhauer would argue that this is precisely the case. He believed that the will to live, the blind, insatiable force that drives all living beings, is inherently tied to suffering. Because to will is to lack, and to lack is to suffer. Think about it: when you desire something, it's because you feel incomplete without it. You suffer until you obtain it. But even when you get what you want, the satisfaction is temporary. The will to live doesn't rest. It immediately finds something else to desire, something else to chase. And so the cycle of suffering continues. This isn't just true for humans. Look at nature. Predators hunt prey in a brutal struggle for survival. Plants compete for sunlight and nutrients. Even the smallest microorganisms fight to replicate and dominate. Life, at every level, is a relentless contest, a war against scarcity and decay. Schopenhauer saw this as the fundamental truth of existence. Life is suffering, and happiness is merely the brief absence of suffering. Now you might be thinking, that's bleak. Why would anyone want to believe that? But here's the thing: Schopenhauer didn't see this realization as a reason to despair. In fact, he believed that accepting the truth about suffering is the first step toward liberation. You see, most of us live in denial. We cling to the illusion that happiness is just around the corner, that if we work hard enough or achieve enough or love deeply enough, we can escape suffering. But this denial only deepens our pain. It sets us up for disappointment, because life will always fall short of our expectations. Schopenhauer argued that the only way to break free from this cycle is to confront suffering head-on, to see it for what it truly is. So let me ask you, what if you stopped running away from suffering? What if, instead of trying to avoid it or numb it, you embraced it as an unavoidable part of life? How would that change the way you live? For Schopenhauer, this shift in perspective is transformative. When we accept suffering as the baseline of existence, we stop seeing it as something to be feared or resisted. Instead, we begin to see it as a teacher, as something that can deepen our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. And in that understanding, we find a kind of freedom, not the freedom to escape suffering, but the freedom to live without illusions. Let's make this practical. Think about the last time you faced a significant challenge or hardship. Maybe it was the loss of a loved one, a breakup, a financial crisis, or a health issue. In the moment, it probably felt unbearable. But looking back, can you see how that suffering shaped you? How it forced you to grow, to adapt, to become stronger or more compassionate? Schopenhauer believed that suffering is the crucible of life, the fire that refines us. When we stop running from it, we begin to see its value. This doesn't mean we should seek out suffering or glorify it. It simply means we should stop pretending that life can or should be free from it. Because when we accept suffering, we also accept life as it truly is, not as we wish it to be. But there's more to Schopenhauer's philosophy than just acceptance. He believed that we can actually transcend suffering, not by eliminating it, but by rising above the will to live. How? Through what he called denial of the will. This might sound abstract, but it's actually a deeply practical idea. Essentially, Schopenhauer believed that we can free ourselves from the constant cycle of desire and suffering by letting go of our attachment to the self. This is where his philosophy intersects with Eastern traditions like Buddhism, which also teach that liberation comes from renouncing desire and ego. For Schopenhauer, one of the most powerful ways to do this is through compassion. When we shift our focus from our own desires and suffering to the suffering of others, we weaken the grip of the will to live. We begin to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of a greater whole. This shift in perspective doesn't eliminate suffering, but it changes our relationship to it. It allows us to experience a deeper kind of peace, a peace that comes from transcending the self. Schopenhauer believed that if we want to break free from the endless loop of striving and suffering, we need to change how we live and how we see the world. He wasn't offering shortcuts or tricks to make life easier. His solution was much harder than that. It begins with the realization that most of what we chase is meaningless. The money, the approval, the status, they're distractions. These things don't fix the emptiness we feel inside, they just mask it for a while. It's like patching up a leaking roof instead of rebuilding it. So what does it mean to live differently? Schopenhauer believed the key was to weaken the force that drives all this striving, the will to live. But here's the twist: you can't fight it directly. The will to live is too fundamental, too ingrained. Instead, the way forward is to step outside of it, to loosen its grip on you. This isn't about giving up on life or retreating into despair. It's about living with clarity, without illusions about what life owes you. One way to do this is through art. Schopenhauer saw art as a rare escape from the constant demands of the will. Music, for example, doesn't serve a practical purpose. It doesn't feed you, clothe you, or help you survive. And yet, when you listen to music, something happens. You stop thinking about yourself, your problems, your desires, your plans. For a moment, you're free. You're not caught in the push and pull of wanting and fearing. You're just there, immersed in something bigger than yourself. It's not happiness, it's something quieter, deeper, and more stable. He believed that experiences like this are some of the few moments when we can truly step outside the endless cycle of suffering. But art isn't the only way to weaken the will. Compassion is another. When you focus on someone else's suffering instead of your own, you stop being trapped in your own desires and frustrations. You see the shared struggle of existence, the way pain connects all living things. And in that moment, The boundaries between you and others blur a little. You're no longer just a single individual with your own endless list of wants and needs. You're part of something larger. This shift doesn't erase suffering, but it changes its meaning. It's no longer just your personal burden. It's part of the human condition, something we all share. But Schopenhauer didn't stop there. He believed the most profound way to transcend the will is through what he called the denial of the will. This isn't about giving up on life or refusing to act. It's about letting go of the idea that life is all about you. Think about how much of our suffering comes from clinging. We cling to our desires, our fears, our ideas of who we should be and what life should give us. And when reality doesn't match those ideas, we feel pain. But what if you let go of all that? What if you stopped insisting that life meet your expectations? This doesn't mean you stop living or caring. It means you stop gripping so tightly. You stop demanding that life be different from what it is. Schopenhauer saw this as the ultimate freedom, not freedom from suffering, but freedom from being ruled by it. And here's the paradox: the more you let go, the more you actually gain. When you stop chasing happiness, you find something more reliable. When you stop trying to control everything, you discover a kind of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. This isn't passive resignation. It's an active choice to live differently, to live with open hands instead of clenched fists. It's not easy. It goes against everything we've been taught about what it means to live a successful life. But Schopenhauer believed it's the only way to truly break free. So here's the question: what would your life look like if you stopped chasing the things you think you need to be happy? Not just the big things, but the small ones too: the approval of others, the need to always be right, the constant pressure to prove yourself. What would happen if you just let all of that go? Would you feel empty, or would you finally feel free? Schopenhauer's philosophy is hard to accept because it asks us to confront truths we'd rather avoid. It tells us that life isn't about happiness, that suffering is unavoidable, and that most of what we chase won't save us. But it also offers something rare: a way to live without being crushed by the weight of life's struggles. It doesn't promise perfection or bliss. It promises clarity, a kind of quiet strength that comes from seeing the world as it is and choosing to live with open eyes. This isn't a philosophy for the faint of heart. It's not comforting, but it is liberating. It tells us that we don't have to be slaves to our desires, that we can live with purpose and meaning even in the face of suffering. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. So now, I leave you with one final question. If you knew that happiness was never the goal, if you understood that life itself is the struggle, what would you do differently tomorrow? Would you keep running, or would you finally stop?